What happens when a late-night talk show host pushes too far and turns what should be a friendly interview into a battleground that ends with security escorting out one of America's most respected figures? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had Stephen Colbert facing backlash from every corner of the internet after his disrespectful treatment of Michelle Obama went viral for all the wrong reasons. This story has everything: heated exchanges, uncomfortable moments, and a host who clearly forgot the basic rules of respect. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment because this one is going to leave you speechless. The Late Show studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as Michelle Obama settled into the guest chair across from Stephen Colbert. The former First Lady radiated her characteristic grace and poise, having done countless interviews over the years. But something felt different about this particular evening. Colbert seemed unusually agitated, shuffling through his note cards with an intensity that made even the production crew exchange worried glances. The makeup team had just finished their final touch-ups, and the audience warm-up comedian had successfully gotten the crowd energized and ready for what they expected to be another entertaining episode. Behind the scenes, producers were making last-minute adjustments to camera angles, completely unaware that they were about to capture one of the most controversial moments in late-night television history. Michelle had arrived at the studio earlier that afternoon, as was customary for major guests. She had spent time in her dressing room reviewing talking points about her latest community outreach initiatives, expecting the conversation to flow naturally from her book to her ongoing work with underprivileged youth. Her team had coordinated with the show's producers weeks in advance, providing a list of preferred topics and areas of discussion that would showcase her current projects. As the cameras rolled and the familiar theme music faded, Colbert launched into his introduction with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. However, those watching closely could detect an underlying tension in his voice, a sharpness that hadn't been there in previous interviews with high-profile political figures. His usual comedic timing seemed off, replaced by something that felt more calculated and deliberate. "Tonight we have the incredible Michelle Obama joining us," Colbert announced to the audience, who erupted in enthusiastic applause. Former First Lady, best-selling author, and someone who has inspired millions around the world. The audience continued clapping as Michelle smiled warmly and waved, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. But rather than easing into the conversation with the typical light-hearted banter that characterized most late-show interviews, Colbert immediately shifted gears. His demeanor changed noticeably as he leaned forward, abandoning the relaxed posture that usually put guests at ease. The change was so abrupt that even the camera operators seemed caught off guard, scrambling to adjust their shots to capture the sudden intensity. "Michelle, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me," Colbert began, his tone becoming more confrontational than conversational. "There's been a lot of criticism about your husband's presidency, and frankly, I think the American people deserve some answers about decisions that were made during those 8 years. You were right there in the White House. You had access to information. You had influence." Michelle's smile faltered slightly, clearly caught off guard by the abrupt change in tone. She had expected to discuss her latest book, her advocacy work, or perhaps share some light-hearted anecdotes about life after the White House. Instead, she found herself facing what felt more like a hostile interrogation than a friendly chat show appearance. Her media training immediately kicked in as she processed this unexpected turn. "Stephen, I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically," Michelle responded diplomatically, maintaining her composure despite the unexpected direction of the conversation. "But I'd be happy to discuss my own work and the initiatives I'm currently focused on. That's really what I'm here to talk about tonight." Colbert wasn't having it. He pressed forward with increasing aggression, clearly intent on pursuing his line of questioning regardless of his guest's obvious discomfort. His note cards lay forgotten on his desk, as he seemed to abandon any pretense of following a prepared script. Come on, Michelle. You can't just deflect like that. You were there for all of it. You had influence. You had a voice in those decisions. The American people have a right to know what really happened behind closed doors. The audience began to sense the shift into atmosphere, their enthusiastic energy gradually giving way to an uncomfortable silence. Murmurs could be heard throughout the studio as people exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the Stephen Colbert they knew and loved, the one who could balance humor with respect, even when discussing serious topics. This was someone who seemed determined to provoke a reaction, regardless of the consequences or basic standards of hospitality. Michelle took a deep breath, her years of experience in high-pressure situations evident as she attempted to steer the conversation back to more appropriate territory. Stephen, I think there might be some confusion here about why I'm on your show tonight. I came here to talk about the work I'm doing with young people, about literacy programs, and about my book. If you have specific policy questions, perhaps those would be better directed to actual policymakers who are currently in office. But Colbert's response made it clear that he had no intention of backing down or returning to the agreed-upon topics. If anything, her attempt to redirect seemed to fuel his determination to push harder. The studio audience watched in growing discomfort as their beloved host continued down a path that was becoming increasingly inappropriate and disrespectful, setting the stage for what would become an unforgettable confrontation. The tension in the studio became palpable as Colbert doubled down on his aggressive approach, seemingly oblivious to the uncomfortable shift in the room's energy. His usual charm had completely evaporated, replaced by something that felt almost predatory in its intensity. Michelle Obama, despite decades of experience handling difficult media situations, found herself in uncharted territory as the host continued his relentless pursuit of controversy. "You know what, Michelle?" Colbert continued, his voice rising, slightly as he gestured emphatically with his hands. "I think you're being evasive, and frankly, it's insulting to our viewers. They tuned in tonight expecting honesty, not political spin. You can't just come on here and pretend like you were some innocent bystander during one of the most controversial presidencies in recent history." The audience's discomfort was now clearly visible, with many shifting in their seats and exchanging worried looks. Some had even started pulling out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that would likely end up all over social media. Within hours, the production crew behind the cameras looked equally concerned, with several producers frantically whispering into their headsets, presumably trying to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating situation. Michelle's composure remained intact, but those who knew her well could detect the subtle signs of her growing frustration. Her hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, were now clasped more tightly together. Her smile, while still present, had become more forced, and there was a steely determination in her eyes that suggested she was reaching her limit with Colbert's unprofessional behavior. "Stephen, I have to say I'm disappointed in the direction this conversation has taken," Michelle responded, her voice carrying a note of authority that commanded attention. "When my team agreed to this appearance, we were told this would be a respectful discussion about my current work and my book. What you're doing right now is not journalism, it's not entertainment, and it's certainly not respectful to your guest or your audience." Rather than taking this as a cue to course correct, Colbert seemed to interpret her pushback as validation of his approach. He leaned back in his chair with a smirk that felt more cruel than comedic, clearly pleased with himself for having gotten under her skin. "Oh, so now we're playing the victim card. That's rich, coming from someone who lived in luxury at taxpayer expense for 8 years." The comment landed like a bombshell in the studio. Several audience members audibly gasped, while others began murmuring their disapproval. Even some of Colbert's most loyal fans in the audience seemed shocked by the blatant disrespect he was showing to a woman who had dedicated her life to public service and advocacy for others. Michelle's eyes flashed with anger, but her voice remained controlled when she responded. "Excuse me? Did you just suggest that my family's service to this country was somehow illegitimate? That we were freeloaders rather than public servants who sacrificed our privacy and security to serve the American people?" Colbert seemed energized by her reaction, as if he had been trying to provoke exactly this response all along. Well, let's be honest about what that service really looked like. Expensive vacations, designer clothes, lavish parties at the White House. Meanwhile, regular Americans were struggling to make ends meet. Don't you think there's some hypocrisy there worth discussing? The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as Michelle processed what she had just heard. For a moment, it seemed like she might stand up and walk off the set, and many in the audience appeared to be hoping she would do exactly that. Instead, she took a deep breath and responded with the kind of measured dignity that had defined her public persona for years. "Stephen, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to conduct this interview with the basic level of respect that any guest deserves," she said, her voice carrying unmistakable authority. "If you want to discuss policy, we can do that. If you want to talk about my book or my current work, I'm here for that. But I will not sit here and allow you to spread lies and disrespect about my family's service to this country." But Colbert had clearly crossed a line from which there was no return. His response would prove to be the final straw that pushed this interview from uncomfortable to completely unacceptable. "Oh, come on, Michelle. You're acting like you're above criticism, like you're too important to answer tough questions. Maybe that attitude is exactly what's wrong with political elites in this country." The words hung in the air, like a challenge, and everyone in the studio could sense that something significant was about to happen. Michelle Obama, one of the most respected figures in American public life, had been pushed to her absolute limit by a host who seemed determined to destroy his own reputation in pursuit of viral controversy. The moment Colbert finished his latest attack, something fundamental shifted in Michelle Obama's demeanor. The diplomatic smile that had remained fixed on her face throughout the increasingly hostile interview finally disappeared completely. Her posture straightened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of her authority and experience as someone who had navigated the highest levels of American politics with grace and dignity. "That's enough," Michelle said firmly, her words cutting through the stunned silence of the studio like a knife. "Stephen, what you're doing right now is not just unprofessional, it's disgraceful. You invited me onto your show under false pretenses, and now you're using your platform to spread misinformation and personal attacks. This is exactly the kind of behavior that's poisoning public discourse in this country." Colbert, rather than recognizing the gravity of the situation he had created, seemed to double down even further. His face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of excitement and defiance, as if he believed he was on the verge of some kind of journalistic breakthrough. "Oh, so now I'm the problem? Not the politicians who promise change and deliver more of the same? Not the elites who lecture regular Americans about values while living completely different lives?" The audience's reaction was becoming increasingly vocal, with scattered boos beginning to emerge from different sections of the studio. Several people had stood up, clearly preparing to leave, while others were actively filming the confrontation on their phones. The production crew looked panicked, with producers desperately trying to communicate with each other about whether they should intervene or continue rolling. Michelle stood up from her chair, a move that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the studio. Her presence seemed to fill the space as she looked directly at Colbert with an expression that mixed disappointment with barely contained anger. "You know what, Stephen? I've spent decades dealing with people who think they can diminish me, who think they can question my integrity, my intelligence, or my right to speak. I've been patient with people who don't deserve my patience, gracious with people who don't deserve my grace. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. But I will not sit here for one more second and pretend that what you're doing is acceptable. You're not asking tough questions. You're not holding anyone accountable. You're just being cruel and disrespectful because you think it will get you attention. Colbert seemed momentarily stunned by the force of her response, but quickly recovered and made what would prove to be his final mistake of the evening. Well, if you can't handle a little pushback, maybe you should stick to writing children's books instead of trying to influence serious political conversations. The comment about children's books, clearly intended as a dismissive jab at her literacy, advocacy work, proved to be the final straw. Michelle's face hardened as she realized that Colbert was not just attacking her personally, but mocking the work she did to help underserved communities and promote education among young people. "How dare you?" Michelle said, her voice rising for the first time during the entire confrontation. "How dare you mock work that helps children learn to read, that gives kids opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have? You're sitting here in your comfortable studio, making jokes about programs that literally change lives, and you think that makes you clever?" The studio erupted as audience members began openly expressing their disapproval of Colbert's behavior. Shouts of "shame on you" and "apologize" could be heard throughout the room, while others simply stood and began heading for the exits. The atmosphere had become so toxic that even Colbert's most loyal supporters seemed uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Michelle gathered her composure one final time, her voice becoming deadly calm as she delivered what would become one of the most quoted moments of the entire debacle. "Stephen, I came here tonight to talk about hope, about opportunity, about the work we can do together to make this country better for everyone. Instead, you've chosen to use your platform to spread division and disrespect. That says everything about who you are and nothing about who I am." She turned toward the audience, many of whom had risen to their feet in a show of support. "To everyone who came here tonight expecting better, I apologize that you had to witness this. You deserve hosts who treat their guests with basic human decency, regardless of political differences." As Michelle moved toward the exit, Colbert made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of his show. "Well, I guess we know who can't handle honest conversation," he called out, his voice cracking slightly as he realized he had completely lost the room. Michelle stopped and turned back toward him one final time. "Stephen, there's nothing honest about what just happened here. But don't worry, I'm sure this will get you exactly the kind of attention you were looking for." Security personnel, who had been quietly moving into position during the final exchanges, escorted Michelle toward the exit as the audience continued their vocal support for her and their disapproval of Colbert. The host sat alone at his desk, suddenly seeming to realize the magnitude of what had just occurred, as his production team scrambled to figure out how to end the show. The confrontation had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone who witnessed it. As Michelle Obama left the studio with her dignity intact, Stephen Colbert was left to face the reality of what his behavior had cost him, both personally and professionally. That's the story of how one of America's most respected figures was pushed to her breaking point by a host who forgot that entertainment should never come at the expense of basic human respect. What did you think of Stephen Colbert's behavior during this interview? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that reveal what really happens when the cameras are rolling.